talking about the modern day in Millwall and stuff that happens now, just coming out the back end of a pandemic, hopefully. A lot of pandemics in the Middle Ages. A lot of those running ravage.
In the Middle Ages, yeah. I mean, there's the big one's the Black Death of the 14th century.
Nearly at the end, though, they just pipped the post. You know, they only had 100 years before Rome got wrecked again, and then they'd have been missed off. They'd have been in whatever comes after.
Well, there's an argument that says no Black Death, a much delayed Renaissance, and you know the counterfactual with no Black Death is very, very, very hard to play. So it's not as we can't be too certain that had the Black Death not come along, you would still have seen the sack of Rome in 1527. But in answer to your first question, the big pandemics of the Middle Ages, yeah, you've got Black Death of the mid 14th century, and then the waves all the way through to 1390s, and much earlier than that, in fact, 800 years earlier than that, you have the Justinianic Plague of Justinian. Harder, really, to be certain about its spread, its virulence. Much more reliant on impressionistic evidence.
What's that?
The Justinianic Plague. Well, the accounts of chroniclers saying, "Oh my God, it was terrible. There was like mad lockdowns and thousands of people dying all the time." There is far less. Like, I can get super nerdy. So, the Justinianic Plague of the 6th century AD seems to have been similar to the Black Death in that it was a form of bubonic plague, which mutated very, very, very infectious and very, very, very deadly. The trouble is, we know a lot about the Black Death and very little about the Justinianic Plague. And a lot of what we have to surmise about the Justinianic Plague is surmised by taking what we know of the Black Death and then transposing its rate of spread and its lethality back onto the fragments of evidence we have from the 6th century. So that the range of estimates of how many people... So with the Black Death of the 14th century, we know with a reasonable degree of certainty that it's 50-60% of the population of Western Europe are killed by the Black Death. We can be quite certain about that. Although it varies from place to place, we can be quite certain about that. However, because of the fragmentary nature of the evidence about the 6th century Justinianic Plague, you're sort of using models from the 14th century and putting them on top of very, very scant evidence. And so the high range of estimates for deaths in the Justinianic Plague, I think, runs to like 100 million. But the low range runs to about 50,000.
Good confidence interval.
Well, it's a problem, right? Now, if you just read the chroniclers from the 6th century, that tallies with this idea that it's closer to 100 million than to 50,000. But the trouble is that chroniclers, we don't tend to trust chroniclers, and they tend to get a bit hot under the collar. I mean, if you only had Daily Mail or Sun or Guardian editorials to go by as your historical source, you would have a somewhat warped idea about the history of the current pandemic, right? You want some stats, you want some data, man. Give me some data. Give me some hard data.
Chroniclers. Is that not what chroniclers are supposed to do? It's kind of in the name. Chronicling things. Not pundits. Punditras. That wasn't their name.
Yes, but there's... So... but if you take we would call, say, Procopius of Caesarea a chronicler. He'd fall under that broad term because he writes histories and contemporary histories of what he's living through in the age of Justinian. But the guy is much closer to a paid by the inch, like shock columnist.
Gossip. Girl.
No, not gossip. I mean a sort of like a rented opinion. It's not quite Katie Hopkins, well, as was before she got whacked. Or he's like Piers Morgan, right?
All right, yeah.
What's the issue of the day? Morgan's got 2 takes, and he just like goes, okay, that one, and he's absolutely brilliant. I mean, totally amoral as a journalist. I don't know him personally. He may be a nice guy, and may not be. I don't know, but as a journalist, he's brilliant because he's either completely enraging or completely sympathetic, depending on just where you stand on this particular issue. And Procopius Caesar is sort of similar, very, very similar to Piers Morgan. And so, if you take, here's a good example of this. Procopius Caesar is supposedly a chronicler. Well, he's just writing what happened. Like Morgan would say, I'm just a journalist. Spends half his career toadying up unbelievably to Justinian, the emperor. Unbelievably. The sort of flatterer, the kind of writing the histories of the wars of Justinian and kind of blowing endless smoke up the emperor's arse. And then he writes The Secret History, which is like the most offensive, damning, tell-all, expose, character assassination, mudslinging, like horror show of an account of Justinian and Theodora, which smears them, absolutely smears them. I mean, it's so entertaining, it's great, but it's like a hell of a flip-flop. And people sort of scratch their heads. Oh, this is, what's going on with Procopius and Caesar here? Man, just look at Piers Morgan and Meghan. Okay, the dude couldn't get his nose out of her. And then she kind of snubbed him, and so he becomes her worst enemy. It's an old story. But it's, so anyway, the point was, chroniclers, no, they don't just chronicle, of course. They're opinion formers. And that's the old fashioned. You've shown your age there. The age of spin. You grew up in the age of spin.
Spinny Hendrix. It's because I love the thick of it. That's why. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. It makes me very happy indeed. Peace.